Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar comic review. This is going to be my review for Avatar The Last Airbender Imbalance Part 3. So, I was able to get the book digitally last night, reviewing it today. So that means I didn't get a review copy, but I'll explain that towards the end of the review because I want to actually have a little bit of a discussion at the end of this video about the whole review copy situation and what did and did not happen. But anyway, Imbalance Part 3 is out, which means it's the end of another Avatar comic trilogy. How does this book work on its own? How does it wrap up the series? And, what are my general thoughts on Imbalance overall? So let's start with some non-spoiler thoughts. For the most part, this is going to be a spoiler review because one, I don't think this is a book that features a ton of spoilers. I wouldn't really be able to pick out a bunch of scenes from this book and be like, well, that's a spoiler, that's a spoiler. Outside of literally just a spoiler being me talking about any of the book, I don't think there's anything like huge here to be spoiled. Overall, what I'd say about this book is that I think it's I think what I said on Twitter last night was, it's fine. It's a pretty average ending to, I think, a series that overall is fairly average. Now, I think it still maintains the general high quality of Avatar comics in that I don't think any of the Avatar comics we've got have been bad. But I would definitely say, having now finished all of Imbalance, this is the weakest Avatar comic trilogy. I think this slots in below North and South. Just because if I was really to laser focus in on one thing, is that this is a book that doesn't have a side plot. It was only about this one thing in Cranefish Town, and there's little bits and pieces of like different groups kind of going on that we focused on within the story, but for the most part it was laser focused on one thing. And I think it didn't help that that wasn't the most interesting thing. That when this book was first announced, some people were interested, some people weren't, because it is a kind of confusing thing, like a book dealing with Aang and co, dealing with the Bender-non-Bender conflict. So where does it come from? But knowing that it can't be resolved in any way, can't be really touched on all that much until Korra, immediately means this book can only do so much. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to play you a clip of myself from a video that I made back in March last year. This was when Imbalance was first announced as being the next Avatar comic series, so none of the books had been released. All we had was the cover for part 1 and the basic product description giving us an insight into this is what the book's going to be about, and I did a discussion on it. And so I'll cut over now to basically a little clip from that of me summing up what I expected Imbalance to be. To me, the problem is just the plot premise. And I've seen a lot of different kind of points about this. I've seen some people very excited that Avatar is finally going to tackle Bender, non-Bender. But I've also seen people like, we already covered that in Korra, and because it was covered in Korra, does that not mean that Korra taking place so much further after this means that it was the main exploration of that, so we're only going to get a much lighter exploration of this topic here because Korra comes later and tackles the same issue? I think there's still open kind of ground to cover with the Bender non-Bender topic, but I don't think it's going to be explored in the way we want, because I think just the history of how the Avatar comics have approached some of these topics I think leads you to believe that more than likely this will get a North and South style exploration of the topic, where they'll lead you to believe probably in the first 2 parts this is a major issue, and then they'll kind of just in part 3 do whatever they can to just make it it's an ongoing issue, we'll have to look at it, but it's not that big of a deal. So as you can see, I think if you read the book, that's fairly spot on. And the fact that it was able to say that so long before the book was even out is extremely telling, that they did exactly what I predicted, especially on the Li Ling front. Before we even had Li Ling, I just had that feeling that that's that would be the way that they would approach doing the conflict, that they'd make it like Gilak. And I think that's exactly what they did here with Li Ling. She had, I think, potential as a villain, but ultimately, I think in this book she only really served to distract from the main topic that I think people wanted to be discussed, which was the actual Bender-non-Bender conflict. Instead, the conflict within this book that we get is Team Avatar versus Li Ling. Now, Li Ling, of course, is amplifying that, and she's a Bender supremacist and so on, but it does shift the focus. It's no longer really about Bender non-Bender and how the team tackles that. It's about how they tackle Li Ling amplifying the situation and creating chaos. It means that for most of these 3 books, we never really touch on the core conflict, to the point at by the end of this book, they seem to be basically just setting up that whatever's coming next is probably just going to be a direct sequel to this. And that, unfortunately, doesn't particularly excite me. The way this book ends of just like, okay, Suki's going to stick here to teach people some chi blocking and like help the police force here. Aang wants to stay here, of course, because he knows there's a conflict here. I don't know if that's a book that I necessarily want to read immediately next, unless there's something big that you can add onto it. Because otherwise it just feels like this was the lightest touching on a topic that we've seen in a long time. And I compare it somewhat heavily to North and South, because I think their exploration of the Bender-non-Bender conflict here is exactly the way they covered Gilak and the people of the South who were against the North. By the end of that book, they're just like, oh, Gilak was a really, really bad guy who was just out to kill people. That meant there was no valid point ever being made here. All Gilak supporters who are still out there, they're just idiots. And I think this book does something very similar here, but I'd arguably say it's worse. And what they do here is, obviously at the start of the book, we know that the reason there's a Bender-non-Bender conflict in Cranefish Town is because the machines coming in has led to Benders losing their jobs. And that's the main conflict. That's why there's violence and stuff like that. And that's ultimately the solution. That's what you need to solve, is that topic. The book never attempts to do that. It touches on it, like, well, I think once in part 2, and then Aang and Sokka have a pretty minor discussion about it in this part, about, you know, are the machines good or bad or anything like that. But fundamentally, they just treat the Benders who are angry at losing their jobs as being Bender supremacists. Obviously, you know, it's one of those things, they end up supporting Li Ling, and she is such a, you know, Bender supremacist, it's not even funny, especially with what they do with her in this book. It just means that you took what could have been a very interesting point and just turned the Benders of this town into the villains, effectively. And I didn't like that at all, because it took to me any nuance out of the discussion. Because it was immediately just like, oh, you just want us to be sympathetic towards the non-Benders, while not really in any way acknowledging the issue of the fact that they've lost their jobs. Like, it's never really touched on that, like, that is a topic that actually needs to be discussed when it's actually, like, the main problem. Like, I acknowledge the fact that, like, look, you can't have the Benders going around being violent and stuff like that, but the fact that no character, pretty much in, like, the entire series almost, touches on the idea that we need to find a way to have Benders and non-Benders exist here, which means jobs for Benders and jobs for non-Benders. That's where I think this book is very frustrating, because it is, like I said, it is just dealing with Li Ling. And I think this book at the same time adds a little bit of depth to Li Ling, but then it is also the book that takes away that depth and just turns her into the second Gilak that we've had in the comics. Because what they do is that they have Rue, who I think probably has the best character arc over the course of Imbalance. I think Rue and her arc over these 3 comics probably stands out as being the biggest sort of highlight from the whole series. She begins to sort of fight back against her parents, kind of really speak out of just like, I'm a non-Bender, the things that you're saying about non-Benders, do they apply to me? Do you hate me as well? And her mother initially just kind of dismisses it and just like, you know, like, come on, stop talking, let's go ahead with this. we get the little bit of backstory. We find out that, okay, the family was originally from Ba Sing Se, and when the Fire Nation invaded, Azula took over, they had to flee. It's this moment of weakness for Li Ling, and you can clearly tell this deeply affected her, this, having to basically just flee from her home, having no power to kind of alter anything. And she blames it on the fact that the Earth Kingdom had poor leadership, and that poor leadership was a non-bender in King Kwai. She blames it on that. And we see her bringing up points like almost like defending Ozai of the fact that, like, oh, my problem isn't with the Fire Nation who took over the place. My problem was with the Earth King who didn't defend the place properly. And it's just like, she's so lost in sort of these kind of like power dynamics. The problem, though, is that when Rue eventually leaks out Li Ling's plan to everyone so they're prepared for her, which eventually leads to her proper defeat at the end of the book, she literally attempts to kill Rue. And that sounds like a very dramatic thing, but it's just like, an action like that just immediately takes the character from being like interesting, complex villain to just, oh, you are just Gilak 2.0, because they do the exact same thing again. The character is just out to kill someone because they disagree. That was Gilak with, Hakoda, and it's the same with Li Ling and Rue here. And in the end, it takes out any point, any sort of like grasping onto like Li Ling's ideals that you in any way had. And because she was such a distraction from the actual main point, it's just like, yeah, that felt like a little bit of a waste of time, that we just sort of spun our wheels over the course of this book. We came in here, found out what the actual problem was. Li Ling amplifies the situation, causes all this chaos, gets everyone violent. Team Avatar stops that violence, but then we're still left with the core problem that we started from in the first place. And they make subtle strides to change things. Like I said, Suki in this book is pretty much here to just teach a bunch of people chi blocking. She teaches the non-bender guards here how to chi block. She actually teaches Rue how to chi block over the course of this book. Now, to be fair, most of this happens off screen, but we do get the setup scene of like her saying, "I will teach you." But that is kind of Suki over the course of this book. And this is where I'll get into with a couple of the characters and on the character writing side of things, that while in general I will praise Faith Erin Hicks for overall how she does the character dynamic writing of the characters, and that I feel she gets the voice of the characters spot on, the dynamic between them in most cases spot on, there are also a few points at which I'm kind of like, you sort of misused that character a little bit. You didn't add enough nuance to that situation. That could have been better done. And I think Suki is a good example of that, in that, in so many ways, she's only in this book because she's the most obvious character that you can use to teach a bunch of people chi blocking. And she's also another non-bender character to have here. My biggest issue with the use of Suki over the course of this book, though, is that all three parts, they never once bring up why she's here, why she isn't guarding Zuko anymore, what's going on with that situation, and especially given that she decides that she's going to stick around to teach the guards of this city how to chi block, and she sort of implies that some of the other Kyoshi warriors are coming to do that as well. You never explain why she doesn't have to do her role as Zuko's bodyguard anymore. And it's that sort of continuity stuff that I think is fairly important to address, because otherwise now it feels like, wait, have you told Zuko, like, you're on a break? Like, because they never said, like, why she was able to come here in the first place. And then they never addressed why, like, she's now able to go on this, like, extended break or anything like that. It just felt like, did you just forget that that was a thing with Suki? Like, I think it needs to be explained. Like, it's an important plot point to address between it, to keep the continuity between the books good. Next, I'll bring up Aang. Now, you immediately may be wondering, like, wait, you're a few minutes into this review, you haven't at all mentioned the whole plot point at the end of part 2 of Aang taking Li Ling's bending away. The reason I haven't mentioned it is because, in the grand scheme of this book, it is not that big of a deal. It's explored in, like, the first 5 pages or so of the book, and then they bring it up later on at the end when we have the final confrontation with Li Ling. And, like, there's, I think, one other point at which it gets, like, a brief discussion. but it's not as serious as you think it is. Like I think after reading it, or at least reading just at least the first exploration of it, you realize this isn't going to be a book wide kind of plot point. You know from the get go, this isn't a situation where Aang can take away her bending. It's not right. It doesn't fit here and is not going to fix the problem. My issue is just with how she writes Aang in this book in relation to his dynamic with the other characters. They have the other characters that give Aang advice, but I do fundamentally feel like she never writes Aang to sort of have his own view on the topic. He's always sort of very much reliant on Katara to present this view, Sokka to present that view, Toph to present that view. And it just feels like you're either making Aang super indecisive, or he just doesn't have an opinion on the topic. And like they try and get across the idea of just like, Aang saying like, I thought it would be simple of just like taking away the Bender's bending would solve the problem because she's the leader of a bending faction. But it wasn't that simple. And it's just like, really, Aang? Like, and it's more, I'm not criticizing the characters so much as I'm criticizing the writing of that. Of just like, I felt like there was a struggle in a way to write Aang correctly in some of these scenes. Especially the scene with Katara, which you can look at that in isolation and be like, that's a very nice scene of, Katara talking about how much her waterbending means to her. And this is her perspective on why a person's bending is so important to them and why Aang needs to be very careful with the decision that he makes. My issue with that is that, Katara, who are you talking to? You are talking to Aang. What is the name of the series? Avatar: The Last Airbender. If he loses his bending, there's no airbenders left in the world. Like, I get that it made sense for Katara to say that, but it just felt like Aang needing to learn that lesson from Katara saying that was just like not the correct one to say that to. And especially when it's never once brought up. I think the very obvious thing, if you're going to have a discussion or back and forth between like Katara and Toph about this, it's never brought up of like the importance of like Toph's bending to her as like a counterpoint. And I felt like that was the way to do it. Not Katara saying this to Aang, who I feel like doesn't need that lesson. But if you're actually having one of the premises of this book was that Katara and Toph would be at conflict, but it's really only the first handful of pages and then they don't really interact much over the rest of the book. It should have been, I think, as part of that discussion back and forth, Katara saying to Toph basically what she said to Aang. And I think that was a huge missed opportunity to do that, because I would have really liked to see Toph's reaction to being the one who's like, she was causing problems, she was a bender, you have to take her bending away. And Katara pointing out that like, how would you feel if you got your bending taken away, given how important it is to you compared to like so many other people? And what her response would be to that. Especially if you are going for the very early setup of Toph eventually becoming chief of police, which they don't really do much with in this book. It feel like those different perspectives would be a nice thing to have for Toph. But they didn't really do it. Another point would be that I think the use of Sokka. I think this book gives the illusion that Sokka is presented as being more important, when in fact I think a lot of his scenes where he presents his opinion on the whole topic feel very like light on substance. That he's like Aang and Sokka have a few talks back and forth about like the situation basically that's going on, but I ultimately don't feel like they say all that much in those scenes. It just feels like there was too much of, well, this isn't that big of a problem because, there is hope for benders and non-benders because I'm friends with you, you're friends with me, and it's just like, what sort of a point is that to make? That, like, two characters who, like, met each other where there was no bender conflict. Like, has Aang and Sokka ever discussed this fact of, like, I'm a bender, you're not a bender, and it been a factor in their friendship at all? And you're trying to make that point about how, because we're friends, it means this can be a problem. It's just like, you're either super stating the obvious or just saying absolutely nothing in those type of scenes. And there's a couple of times where they do that. I'll try and find them here. Again, it's a 70-page book. It's kind of hard to find the exact page just off the top of my head here. But yeah, like I think I discussed this when the preview came out, of just like Sokka, you know, the discussion with Aang and Sokka about the machines. Aang is kind of like, well, the machines are kind of a problem, but Sokka presents the idea of actually, but it helps benders, and you know, things are better now for benders that it would have been different a few years ago without the technology. And it's like, yeah, but like, Sokka, do you not understand the problem that the benders have lost their jobs? And like, if they had jobs, there wouldn't be a problem, kind of as such here. And your solution doesn't involve the benders at all. And I think it really misses the mark in some ways on that. But yeah, let me try and find that scene here. Probably actually, now that I'm going through it here, probably Sokka and Suki's best scene, I think, in like the entire series, is when Rue goes to find them to inform them of her mother's plan so they can be prepared. And the two of them are there, and they get a chance to talk to Rue, and it's sort of fitting. This is probably the most fitting scene of Sokka and Suki together presenting the sort of non-bender perspective, in that I don't think this is a scene that could have happened if Rue was saying this to Aang or Katara or Toph. But you know, you have Suki saying here, I know it's difficult, but you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe what your mother and sister are doing is wrong. And Sokka says, I know a guy who was once in a similar situation. His dad was the worst dad ever and wanted to conquer the world. It took a whole lot for Zuko to stand up to his father, but eventually he did. And that's one of the reasons why the 100-Year War finally ended. You have a chance to do good, don't waste it. And you know, she goes ahead with it and then asks if she can learn chi blocking. I like that because it's them noting that, like, the situation that you're going through right now, it's not the same, but it's somewhat similar to Zuko. Zuko standing up against Ozai is one of the reasons the war ended. And this is kind of a war in a way, and you have a chance to end it by giving your advice here. And yes, it's your mother and sister you're kind of betraying here, but you know you're in the right here. So it was one of the, I think, just the best scenes in the book, for me anyway, and that's why, again, I'll highlight Rue is the highlight of this book, and that's cool that they managed to get one of the new characters across so well, but it's also unfortunate that none of the main cast really stand out as like, oh, you have to read this book because of this character in it or that character in it. They also make this point here, it comes in like right at the end, there's maybe like 2 pages in the whole book that addresses it. Aang goes up to other benders, like the benders of Cranefish Town who aren't violent. So just these sort of innocent benders, and asks, you know, like don't you want to, you know, help solve the problem? If you really want to help, you can stand with me to protect your neighbors. And they're kind of like, well, I'm sorry, Avatar, you're asking too much, and they just go off on their own. And it's like they don't want to get involved in this. They don't want to just like use up their time to stand with the non-benders or whatever, because I suppose from their perspective it's just like, you know, their lives are fine. Do they really need to stand up for the non-benders with what's going on? I think it's a little bit of a muddled thing because, like I said, the book, I just feel like, ignores the whole fact of like, yes, the benders are the ones kind of ultimately at fault here, but you've done nothing to try and solve the problem of like, they've lost their jobs. That's what they're angry about in the first place. It's just very kind of weird overall. And then at the end of the book, they kind of come back with that, and they just note that, like, oh, it was a bit of a mystery that, like, the other benders didn't support everyone in what was going on here. And that's another one of the things that makes Aang kind of realize that, oh, like, I actually do need to, you know, stick around here and help out. And you know, it's a cute scene, like, as you get all of this stuff, like, right at the end of the book. It's a fun moment of, like, Aang saying, I've been thinking I want to stay in Cranefish Town for now. I feel a connection to this place. It has so many problems, but if it was able to overcome them, it could become something really special. Maybe we could stay put for a while if that's okay with you. And then Katara says, I agree, this city needs you. And Aang says, I think the city needs us. And you get a very cute kind of Katara and Aang holding hands moment there. just showing that they are going to stick around here. And at the top panel, you do see the kids kind of playing, that there's, some hope for it, and they just end the book on the note of like, I also think this city needs a better name. I'll get Sokka on that right away. Obviously, again, if there's one takeaway from Imbalance, it is just that they confirm Cranefish Town is like the origin of Republic City. That better name they're joking about there is ultimately going to be United Republic or Republic City, whatever way you want to call it. The problem I have just with that as the end of the book is that, like, does that mean the next book is literally just going to be a sequel to this that's going to focus on topics like pollution is another thing that they brought up here a few times. I think it's like Sokka mentions it as well at the end, that there's like the main issues that they need to deal with are like pollution and stuff like that. And here's probably I think the very frustrating moment towards the end of the book with Aang and Sokka. Sokka comes up to Aang and says, "Tough day, huh? Yeah. The last time we were in this area, Spirit was threatening the humans who lived here. I chose to protect the humans. There was the divide between humans and spirits. I wasn't able to bridge the divide. I failed. Now there's the divide between benders and non-benders. I'm not sure how to fix that either. Hey, you bridged that divide with me, didn't you? You're a bender, I'm a non-bender, we're friends. It gives you a little bit of a hope, doesn't it? Yes, a little hope." And it's like, okay, that's helpful, that two characters who are basically best friends and their friendship has nothing to do really with the fact that they're bender and non-bender. That gives hope for this conflict that relates to like who has a job, who doesn't, and stuff like that. But anyway, it's just a weird one where like it was clear that I think the biggest problem that this book had is that them choosing to tackle this topic meant that they were just from the get-go severely limited with what they could and couldn't do, because Korra has to get to the point where the equalist movement is a thing. It has to get to a point where Amon, Hiroshi, and those type of people build up that organization, and it gets to that point of the proper bender non-bender sort of conflict, and it seems to more or less end with the idea that Republic City elects a president. It's a non-bender president, and that's more or less all that we sort of need in everything here. That the place moves from being primarily bender kind of focused in its leadership to actually having an overall leader who's a non-bender, and that's fine. That's great. I just don't feel you needed to focus that much time on it, and especially if, as this book kind of seems to tease, I don't need 6 books covering this topic. I don't need these 3 books and then the next 3 potentially covering it. I really hope they find a way to, with the next book, cover some other topic. I continue to suggest the idea that I think we're completely in line for a time skip at some point, because the problem with having so many of the books focused on just raw setup for like United Republic and stuff like that is that you're very much getting lost in a lot of minutiae that you don't need to get kind of lost into, when I think what people want is to see the key moments in the characters' lives. They want it to be the character-focused moments. Of course, I think people want to see the moment where like Zuko and Aang come in, what really creates Republic City, the big moments. We don't need to know like, oh, this is how the Water Tribe developed its new port to connect with the rest of the world. That this is how Cranefish Town developed from being like 10% Republic City to being 20% Republic City. It's just the level of like, how important was this book in the grand scheme of the story? I don't think really that important. Like I said, the main takeaway is just that Cranefish Town is Republic City. I don't think the book says a lot over its 3 parts with its exploration of any of these topics or anything like that, because Korra does a decent job on its own of, I think, introducing the general concept of bender-non-bender conflict, with the triads being the main bender problem. Here, it's just, angry people who lost their jobs, and they don't really even tackle that well. And it's just, it's a book of sort of like frustrations, where the art from Peter Wortman is great. A lot of the scenes, just panel to panel, are very, very nice, of just, like Sokka and Toph interacting, just really, really, like, exactly the way you want it. Cute Katara and Aang moments. But the problem is that these books have to be more than just a couple of fun character interactions. I think any decent writer can write Toph like Toph. It's one of those things where, like, she's such a popular character because it's such a simple kind of dynamic for the character. She's extremely powerful, she's extremely sassy. Put the two things together in a situation, done. That's it. Similarly with Sokka, just, make him a little bit comedic, intelligent, done. What I wanted out of this more was to see a few risks. See Faith Aaron Hicks write the characters in a bigger situation, a situation where there's stuff at stake and so on. And I feel the problem with this book is just that it's so safe. It plays it extremely safe because none of the main characters really have a character arc overall. Toph has the kind of rivalry with Yaling over the course of the book, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Aang, they try and bring in this whole thing, will he take Li Ling's bending away? And I'll get back to some more talk about that in a second. But again, it fizzles out by the end. Like I said with Sokka and Suki, outside of one or two little moments, there's no real presentation of the bender non-bender kind of perspective from their point of view or anything like that. It's just the whole group is here doing this topic. It's fine. That's really all there is. But anyway, we'll move on. Where do they go? How do they resolve the Li Ling and Aang situation? Will he take her bending away or not? For me, the best way to describe this is just picture the promise and basically the exact way they do how Aang deals with that promise to Zuko of take him out if he gets out of line. And what Aang does and the way kind of Katara acts to that, and that Katara really helps to bring Aang to a good conclusion on that. They do pretty much the exact same thing here of anytime Aang looks like he's about to act on it, Katara's kind of there just urging him to make sure you're making this decision for the right reasons. And it's fine, and I think if you haven't read The Promise in a while, it probably comes across as very good. Me, who does reread The Promise quite regularly, it felt like a really bad carbon copy because it's so similar of Aang in the Avatar state going up to her, just about to do the job. In The Promise's case, of course, kill Zuko. In this book's case, take Li Ling's bending away, and then Katara kind of comes in sort of last minute, asks Aang to think about it, and then he makes his decision. And it's just I think after The Promise, you didn't need Katara to be as sort of hands-on with Aang about this. I think it makes Aang look a little weak as a character that he has to rely so heavily on Katara to make any sort of an important decision. This is something that I think it wasn't important enough. It was so obvious of the resolution that you needed here that Aang should have just been able to make this decision on his own without needing to have kind of Katara, almost drag him back in the Avatar state before going ahead with this. It's not too big of a problem, really, but like I said, I'm a little kind of worried about just a presentation of Aang as a character with regards to the writing. I think there's a few little bits and pieces that make me think can we write Aang as Aang? Can Aang have his own opinions on things? He is the Avatar after all. Why is it just everyone else's opinion and him kind of looking for them instead of his own? But anyway, anything else to add? Yeah, like I said in the whole Yaling thing, I thought they were setting up something with how heavily her and Toph were sort of going at it over the course of especially part 2 and 3. But they really just bring it to an end in a way where by the end of the book, Li Ling's taken away, I assume, to prison. A lot of the other benders are taken away to prison. And I get the impression that Yaling is just taken away with them. There's no sense of she suddenly sides with her sister. Rue, because she, changed sides pretty much at the end, kind of gets away with it and has to deal with the fact that, her family is, kind of fractured now because of the decision that she made, but she knows she's on the right side. And, Suki gives her one last piece of advice to Rue. It's just maybe, but it's over now. All that's left to decide is what you want to do next. And I think there's potential in that. Like, I think the one thing I'd like to come back to from this book is not the politics of Cranefish Town or the next small step of the journey. I do want to see where Rue goes next, given that, she is so separate from her family now. There's this whole interesting dynamic of her mother and sister are both very much Bender supremacists in a way. And maybe you have some hope for Yaling being able to turn the corner on that, and, maybe if Toph moves more into the police thing, maybe she'll want Yaling as part of that. Because I think the one thing they did with Yaling was they definitely presented her as being a very strong earthbender. Because the fight that Yaling and Toph have in this book is relatively even. Like, it's like Toph is kind of on the back foot a bit here, because of how strong Yaling is. So I think there's a lot of potential there, and I think Toph might. I think at this point Toph has seen that in her. So I think there's some hope for Yaling, but Rue is definitely the character they present as being like pretty important going forward. Like, I could see some sort of a thing like Rue joining the Kyoshi Warriors. I'd be perfectly fine with that. I think that's a cool little thing to do. Or is Rue meant to be the sort of origin of like sort of why there is a sort of chi blocking kind of underground in a way within the city, that like wherever things go she becomes a master chi blocker or something like that. There's a few directions you can go, but I definitely like where they kind of went with things with Rue. Anything else? Like I said, the non-bender guards, they do teach them chi blocking, but again, I thought they'd more go down the direction of setting up the metal bender police force, but they seem to be more setting up a heavier, like, non-bender police force. There are some suggestions towards the bender police force in that, like, during the fight with Yaling, Toph ends up using like a metal wire and kind of thinks like, oh, this is actually quite useful. And it's I think it's meant to be a setup for the metal whips and stuff like that the police force will go on to use later. But yeah, not too much else to say there. Yeah, a big moment for Rue again. I think the most telling one is where she does confront her mother and reveal that, like, I told them about your plan. And because she's learned a little bit of chi blocking before this, when her mother begins to kind of, in a way, kind of get violent, she's going to go back against Rue here. Rue attempts to chi block her mother, Li Ling. But obviously, Li Ling is a skilled bender. She quickly, takes down Rue. And this is like the turning moment. Like, it is a serious moment and it's intense. It's just, it is also you've turned this character from an interesting, complex character into just a full-on villain. Like, it's borderline comical how, like, quick and sudden it is that, like, she's willing to just earthbender into the ground and crush her in the ground if not for the arrival of Aang on the scene. So yeah, that's about all I want to say. Again, I'll probably have other videos coming out. There'll be a podcast review at some point and stuff like that. More discussion on this, and like I said, I'll have a Imbalance in review when I get a chance to read all of the 3 books in a row and stuff like that. But yeah, just to end on some quick final notes of like I said, I want to make it very clear that while I think a lot of this review has focused on maybe criticism more than praise, I still think the quality level of the comics is very high. I would give this book a 7 out of 10, and like I said, I think overall Imbalance is a 7 out of 10 series. The problem, though, is that I think the general quality level of the previous comics suggests that you expect a little bit more. You expect like at least kind of an 8 out of 10 series, and this kind of comes up a little short, while still being good. Still better than a lot of sort of tie-in comics from like other franchises and stuff like that. But we need to be careful that, at least in my opinion, North and South and Imbalance, the 2 most recent comic series from Avatar, have been the weakest of them. We need to be careful that we sort of stop this sort of sliding slope and get back on track and tell some more important stories that get people more invested, because I don't know about you guys, but like I haven't seen a ton of hype heading into Imbalance Part 3 online. there's been people who want to know what happens, like looking out for my review and stuff like that, asking if I've got the review copy and stuff like that. But I haven't seen like tons of discussion going on about this book, people speculating away about what's next or what's going to happen. Whereas, you know, the new Inside Editions book, Legacy of the Fire Nation, they released one image, like just like in those couple of preview pages that Core News put up, just that image of an older Katara sitting next to Iroh with a kind of baby Kaya there playing with a kind of young Boomy. That image stirred up more excitement in the fandom for a book that I think a lot of people ultimately are not going to care about too much when it comes out than the actual like mainline comic series. That's, I think, very, very telling in terms of you need to have those type of moments in the book. The moments that can get the fans going, like, you need to read this comic because there's such great moments. And that's where I'm kind of feeling that, like, I think they need to time skip. I think they need to have the characters be older so you can really create some different dynamics between the characters. You need to really begin to give them their character arc. Like, Sokka needs a plot of his own. He needs to become the leader that we know he eventually gets to. We need to see that happen, and so on. We need to get those just borderline fan servicey type things that people want to know about, and we need to get a book that covers them. When is Aang going to find the other Sky Bison? That's a plot point that can happen at any point, and like, why can't we have that happen? And that leaves you a lot of potential for, I assume, what is probably a, you know, kind of Katara and Aang, you know, traveling. They happen to hear some rumors or something like that, come across the other Sky Bison, and that's a great moment for Aang. It's also a great moment for Appa. You will allow one of the animal characters to step into the spotlight, and then for Katara, who in like previous books has been like highlighted as like she kind of wants to like learn more about Aang's culture, sort of be more involved in that side of things with him. I think that'd be just a great experience for her to see the happiness of him as he meets those other Sky Bison. Like, there's potential there, and this is why I was kind of like hoping that by the end of this book they'd take the decision to maybe kind of split the group up a little bit, you know, have Sokka go off on his own for a little bit. I think it ultimately made sense for Katara and Aang to stick around in the town and stuff like that, but just more moving so that the characters can have more arcs of their own, because I feel when you keep them just forever as a group, it limits what you can do with like any one individual member of the team. But we need to get back into the comics having important stories along the lines of The Promise, The Search, The Rift, and even Smoke and Shadow. But that's been my review. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on the book. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.